Chapter 1: A Republic in the Dust. Listen and let the desert do what it has always done best: soften sharp edges. Out here in the Mojave's wide, patient dark, even history learns to speak quietly. The wind takes the day's heat and carries it away like a secret. The stars hang so steady they feel pinned in place. And if you sit close enough to a small fire, if you let its light warm your hands and your eyelids grow heavy, you can almost believe the world has always been this simple: flame, breath, sand, and the slow turning of time. But the world was not always this simple. A long time ago, long before the Brahmin trails, before the caravan bells, before the cracked highways became landmarks for lost people, there was another world. Bright, loud, certain of itself. It built towers and promises and machines that answered every wish until it began to believe it could not be harmed. Then came the Great War. A single day, a few hours, and the old world burned so thoroughly that even its shadows became legends. When the fires cooled, what remained was not a kingdom of survivors or a clean slate, but a scar, an immense salted wound called the wasteland. And in that wound, slowly, something strange began to grow. Not a raider gang with a banner, not a cult with a prophecy, not a warlord's empire hammered together with fear. A republic. If you're new to these stories, if names like NCR feel like letters on a faded map, don't worry. You don't need to know every battle, every law, every politician's smile. The quiet history is not built from speeches. It is built from ordinary hands, from tired decisions made at dusk, from communities choosing rules over rage, again and again, until the choice becomes a habit, and the habit becomes a nation. So close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the early years after the bombs. Not the dramatic parts, no heroic silhouettes against mushroom clouds. Think instead of the small realities. A well that tastes of rust, a child's cough in winter, the fear of strangers on the horizon. Think of people learning, painfully, that the world had no caretaker anymore. Some hid underground in vaults, as their ancestors planned. Some did not make it into the vaults at all. Some crawled into cellars, caves, sewers, the bones of ruined cities. Many died, many changed, but a few, stubborn and ordinary, kept doing the same human thing humans always do when they want to keep living. They gathered, they planted, they argued, they tried to make tomorrow slightly less cruel than today. One of those gatherings became Shady Sands. It began near the wastes of Southern California, where the earth is hard and the horizon feels far away. The first settlers were not kings. They were refugees. Many of them traced back to Vault 15, one of those underground shelters built before the war. When that vault finally opened and its people spilled into the sunlight, they found that the surface had not been waiting with open arms. It had been waiting with hunger. So they did what surface people always do. They found a place with water, even if it was stubborn water that needed to be coaxed from deep ground. They built walls, not high enough to be proud of, but high enough to make raiders hesitate. They wrote down who owned what. They counted seeds. They watched the sky for dust storms and watched the hills for movement. In those days, leadership did not come from polished titles. It came from the person who could keep a community from tearing itself apart. Aradesh was one of those people. He was not a conqueror. He did not dream of flags. He was, by the standards of the wasteland, almost painfully reasonable. Someone who understood that survival required more than bullets. It required trust. It required routine. It required the courage to punish theft even when hunger made theft understandable. And it required allies. Because the wasteland does not reward isolation for long. Shady Sands had fields, but it also had enemies. Raiders, slavers, the slow, creeping dangers that don't announce themselves until the town wakes up and someone is missing. There were other settlements too, Junktown, the Hub, places that had their own rules, their own temperaments. Some traded, some threatened, some pretended to be friendly until they weren't. And then there were the old horrors, creatures that belonged to a new ecology of radiation and ruin. The kind of things that made parents pull children indoors at night and bar the doors even when the air was hot and the room became close and breathless. In that fragile era, Shady Sands might have stayed just another dot on the map. One more hopeful camp that lasted until someone stronger arrived. But history, even quiet history, sometimes turns on a single traveler. A vault dweller. Someone from another vault, Vault 13, passed through this part of the world during a time of crisis. Their name is not important in the way stories often pretend names are important. What matters is what happened. Shady Sands survived long enough to become something sturdier than a settlement. Threats were faced, lives were lost. Choices were made that shaped the tone of the place, less like a fort, more like a town that wanted laws. Aradesh's daughter, Tandy, was part of that shaping. If Aradesh was the careful spine of Shady Sands, Tandy was its restless heart. She grew up under the same wasteland sky, learned the same hard lessons, but carried them differently. Where some people respond to danger by shrinking their world, she responded by widening it. She understood something that would define the NCR for centuries to come. If you want peace, you cannot only defend your walls. You have to give people a reason to stand beside you. And reason is a strange currency in the wasteland. It can be traded. It can be stolen. It can be counterfeited. But when it is real, when it is backed by food, safety, fairness, and the slow dignity of predictability, it becomes stronger than fear. That is how a republic begins. Not with fireworks, with paperwork, with agreements, with councils that argue for hours about water rights while the sun climbs and falls and climbs again. With people deciding, in the most unglamorous way possible, that their future should not belong to the loudest gun. Over time, Shady Sands grew. It became the kind of place that attracted traders who wanted a reliable stop, farmers who wanted a chance to keep what they grew, and families who were tired of moving every season like prey. And as it grew, it began to do what growth always does. It reached outward. This was not expansion at first, not in the grand imperial sense. It was contact, trade routes, shared patrols, mutual defense. A cautious handshake offered to the next settlement over, and then another, until those handshakes began to form a chain. The hub, with its caravans and merchant houses, was a heartbeat of commerce in the region. Junktown had its own rough stability. The Boneyard, what remained of Los Angeles, was a sprawl of old-world skeletons and new-world survivors. Each place had its own identity, its own grudges, its own scars. But all of them understood one thing: when raiders massed, when slavers sniffed weakness, when monsters wandered too close, a single town could be swallowed. Together, they could endure. And so, in time, endurance began to look like ambition. It is important to say this gently, because the NCR's story is often told in loud voices, either as a shining ideal or as a hungry machine. The truth, like most truths, is quieter and more complicated. The NCR was born from hope, yes, but it was also born from the wasteland's endless pressure. When people are squeezed long enough, they either break into violence or compress into structure. Structure became the NCR's answer. In 2186, Shady Sands and its allies took a step that would echo across the West. They formed the new California Republic. This was not just a name. It was a claim, a fragile attempt to resurrect an old-world idea that had once seemed dead. That ordinary people could be citizens, not subjects. That laws could be written, debated, amended. That leadership could be chosen, not taken. They drafted a constitution. They created offices. They organized responsibilities that the wasteland usually leaves to chance. Policing, taxation, courts. They set out the shape of a government that could outlive any one person's strength. And Tandy, once the daughter of a small-town leader, became a central figure in this new experiment. She would go on to serve for years, shaping policy and tone, becoming a symbol of the NCR's persistence. If you have heard NCR soldiers speak, you might think the Republic arrived fully formed, marching under a flag like it had always existed. But that is the myth that uniforms like to wear. The quieter truth is that the NCR was improvised. It borrowed pieces from wherever it could, old world texts salvaged from ruins, lessons from caravan companies, the practical necessities of frontier survival. It copied what worked. It discarded what didn't. It made compromises, sometimes noble, sometimes ugly. Because governing the wasteland means governing scarcity, water, land, safety, medicine, ammunition, labor, justice. Every one of these things becomes political when there isn't enough to go around. And yet, Despite the shortages, despite corruption that would creep in like sand through a cracked window, despite mistakes and overreach, the NCR did something that deserves to be remembered, especially in a world that forgets so easily. It normalized civilization. It made it possible for a child to be born under a roof that would still be there next year. It made it possible for a merchant to sign a contract and expect it to matter. It made it possible for a farmer to plant for a future that felt longer than the next raid. And that is why, even now, out here in the Mojave night, you can find NCR stamps on old crates, NCR coins in a scavenger's pouch, NCR paperwork tucked into the lining of a coat. Proof that someone once believed order could be carried like a lantern through darkness. The fire beside you crackles softly. If you were to open your eyes, you might see the faint outline of the highway cutting across the sand like a healed wound. You might see the distant silhouettes of broken signs, the remains of the old world that never stops watching. But keep them closed if you can. Because the next part of the story is not about ideals written on clean paper. It is about what happens when a republic grows hungry. It is about rangers and soldiers, about caravans and taxes, about the long reach of bureaucracy into places that used to answer only to the gun. It is about the republic becoming real. So real that it casts a shadow. And as we follow that shadow west and then east, you will hear the NCR's quiet history the way it truly was. Not a single triumph, but a long procession of small decisions, each one made by someone tired, someone afraid, someone hopeful, someone stubborn enough to keep building. For now, let the desert hold the first truth. The NCR began as a town that refused to die. It began as neighbors who chose rules instead of revenge. It began as a small light in a ruined world, flickering, imperfect, but persistent. And in the wasteland, persistence is its own kind of miracle. Chapter 2. Paper, Patrols, and the Long Reach of Order. The desert has a way of teaching patience. It teaches it to the stones, which do not move but are never truly still. It teaches it to the wind, which can spend 1,000 years sanding a single corner smooth. And it teaches it to people, if they survive long enough to learn. Shady Sands survived. Then it changed its name, in a way. Or rather, it let a larger name settle over it like a cloak. The New California Republic. And once a place becomes a republic, the world expects certain things from it. Words, laws, stamps, borders, promises. In the wasteland, promises are heavy. At first, the NCR's promises were modest. It promised that roads would be safer than they used to be. It promised that disputes would be heard by someone other than the nearest person holding a gun. It promised that trade could happen without every exchange ending in blood. It promised that if you were wronged, there was a place to go, some desk, some office, some court, where your complaint could become more than a shouted grievance. That was the dream. And like most dreams, it began to harden into routine. Because to keep a road safe, you need patrols. To keep patrols moving, you need food, ammunition, boots, salaries, and schedules. To pay salaries, you need taxes. To collect taxes, you need records. To keep records, you need clerks. And once you have clerks, you have lines. Long, tired lines of citizens waiting for permits, petitions, property claims, and judgments that never come quickly enough. Civilization, it turns out, does not arrive on horseback. It arrives in triplicate. The NCR's early decades were not a straight march into glory. They were a slow wrestling match with reality. The Republic expanded because it almost had to. Each new settlement that joined, willingly or grudgingly, added strength. It also added responsibility. And every new mile of territory added a new set of problems that did not care about ideals. Bandits, drought, old grudges, and the simple fact that a distant government feels like a stranger, even when it calls you citizen. Still, the NCR grew. It reached toward the great trading centers of the region, the hub foremost among them, a place whose merchant houses and caravan companies had survived by doing what the wasteland always rewards: moving goods, moving information, moving influence. The hub understood stability as a business model. If the NCR could make roads safer, caravans could travel farther. If caravans could travel farther, profits grew. And when profits grow, politics follows like a shadow. So you begin to see the shape of the NCR not only in speeches, but in ledgers. Caravan routes became arteries. NCR patrols became the muscle around those arteries. Towns along the roads began to breathe a little easier, and in return they paid into the machine that kept the roads open. Some did so gladly. Others did so because the alternative, standing alone, felt worse. This is an important point, and it is one fans of old-world ideals sometimes forget. The NCR was not born into a clean landscape. It was born into a patchwork of settlements with their own laws, their own bosses, their own private armies, and informal justice. Bringing them under a single banner was never going to feel gentle to everyone. But to many, especially those who had spent their lives on the edge of a knife, the NCR's order was worth the discomfort. You could see it in small things. A farmer fencing a field with the expectation it would still be his next year. A shopkeeper accepting NCR currency and believing it would be honored elsewhere. A caravan master planning a route weeks ahead, not hours. A family sending a child to a schoolhouse, however crude, because they believed the future might last long enough to justify learning. These things are quiet. They do not make good propaganda posters, but they are how a nation becomes real. And then, inevitably, the nation began to grow teeth. The NCR did not invent the idea of armed men. Every town had guards, every caravan had hired guns, every raider gang had its own brutal discipline. What made the NCR different was that it tried, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to make force answer to law. The Republic built an army. It organized ranks, uniforms, supply lines. It trained soldiers to obey commands that were not shouted in panic. It created a structure that could send men and women into danger not as lone heroes, but as parts of a larger plan. And alongside its regular troops, the NCR's law enforcement traditions took on a distinct flavor. Rangers. If you picture a ranger, you might imagine a lone figure on the edge of a campfire's reach, watching the darkness with a calm that comes from experience. In NCR territory, Rangers became something like a promise made flesh, that the Republic's law could reach even the lonely places. In the earlier days, Ranger was as much a role as a title. Scouts, trackers, veterans with hard eyes who knew the land better than they knew comfort. Over time, the identity sharpened. Rangers were used for longer patrols, dangerous reconnaissance, and the kind of work that demanded discretion and grit. They became stories told in bars. The ranger who found a missing caravan. The ranger who put down a raider chief. The ranger who walked into a lawless town and left it quieter. But stories, like sand, can cover a lot. The truth is that the NCR's force, Army and Rangers alike, was always pulled between two pressures. One pressure was safety. People wanted protection, and they wanted it yesterday. The other pressure was expansion. Every time the NCR grew, it created new frontiers that needed guarding, new towns that needed policing, new roads that needed patrols. The Republic was always chasing the edges of itself, trying to keep up with its own footprint. And expansion brought politics, whether anyone invited it or not. Because as the NCR grew, wealth began to gather in recognizable shapes. In a land where survival used to be measured in bullets and water, the NCR introduced something that sounds almost quaint. Property, titles, claims, ownership recognized by courts, land that could be bought and sold not by violence, but by paper. This was progress. It was also a new battlefield. Brahmin herds grew. Ranches expanded. Caravan companies became powerful. Families who had managed to secure resources early, water access, grazing land, trade contracts, found themselves becoming a kind of nobility in everything but name. In NCR territory, people sometimes spoke of barons, not because the Republic officially crowned anyone, but because influence has a way of creating its own crowns. And where wealth gathers, corruption follows. Not always as a villain in a dark coat, more often as a quiet favor, a contract awarded to a friend, a sheriff who looks the other way for the right price, a politician who begins to confuse the Republic's interests with the interests of the people who fund his campaigns. This, too, is part of the NCR's quiet history, that it tried to bring back the old world's strengths, and in doing so, it sometimes brought back its weaknesses. Still, the Republic endured. Its greatest test in those years came not from raiders, but from something older and stranger, an enemy that belonged to the deep ruins of the old world. Far to the west, along the coast, and in the shadows of pre-war facilities, the enclave lingered. Remnants of a pre-war power structure that saw itself as the rightful heir to the United States. To the enclave, the wasteland's survivors were not citizens. They were contaminants, mistakes that needed to be erased so the old world could be restored for the chosen few. The conflict that followed, events remembered most clearly around the time of Fallout 2, was not simply a war of guns. It was a war of definitions. Who gets to be human? Who gets to inherit the Earth? Does survival grant legitimacy, or only pedigree? The NCR did not defeat the Enclave alone, and it is important to be honest about that. In those years, individuals and many groups played decisive roles, but the Republic benefited profoundly from the Enclave's fall. Equipment, infrastructure, strategic knowledge, pieces of the old world changed hands, and in the aftermath, the NCR's confidence grew. It had looked into the teeth of a terrible thing and lived. After that, the Republic's appetite for the future became stronger. It pushed influence north and east. It dealt with places like New Reno, where power was traded in vice and violence and the thin veneer of family. It negotiated with, pressured, and sometimes absorbed communities that valued their independence. It extended its reach toward resource-rich areas like Redding, drawn by the simple truth that a nation needs more than laws. It needs raw materials, steady supply, and control over what keeps its cities alive. And always, the Republic believed in roads. If you want to understand the NCR, picture a map. Not a map of heroic battles, but a map of routes. Highways turned into caravan trails, trade corridors threaded with outposts, patrol stations planted like nails to hold the Republic's shape together. Each outpost was a statement. We are here, and we intend to remain. For the people living under NCR protection, that statement could feel like relief. For those living outside it, it could feel like a threat. Because the NCR did not only expand through kindness. Sometimes it expanded because it had the power to do so, and because the Republic's leaders believed, truly believed, that their system was better than the alternatives. In the wasteland, that kind of belief can become a weapon without anyone noticing the moment it sharpens. Tandy's long leadership became a symbol of stability. Under her, the NCR came to be seen, by many, as the closest thing the West had to a functioning nation-state. Laws were formalized. Institutions matured. The Republic began to speak with a more confident voice. But time passed. New leaders came. New crises grew. And somewhere beneath the flags and patrol schedules, the same question waited, patient as the desert. Can order stay righteous when it becomes large? Or does size always invite compromise? The fire beside you has burned lower now, the flames less eager, the light softer on the sand. If you were listening closely, you might hear the distant echo of boots on an old highway. NCR boots, marching not into myth, but into logistics. Because the next chapter of the NCR's quiet history carries us toward a place where the Republic's strengths and weaknesses become impossible to ignore. Toward the east. Toward a river that cuts through the desert like a promise. Toward the Mojave, where the NCR will meet not only raiders and hardship, but rivals with their own flags, their own stories, their own visions of what the future should be. And in that meeting, the Republic's quiet history will become louder, whether it wants to or not. Chapter 3. Toward the river, toward the dam. There is a particular kind of silence that lives just before a march. Not the silence of peace, never that, but the hush of preparation, the soft counting of supplies, the murmur of names on a roster, the scrape of a boot being mended because no one wants to admit how far the road will be. The NCR learned that silence as it grew. Back west, in the Republic's core, the idea of nation started to feel ordinary. People argued about taxes the way old world people must have argued, like it mattered, like there would be a next season to argue in. Merchants complained about regulations, farmers complained about inspectors, politicians complained about one another. All of it, strangely, was proof of success. But the wasteland is not impressed by paperwork. It waits until you believe you've become stable, and then it tests whether your stability can travel. The NCR's stability traveled on roads, and roads always lead somewhere. Eventually, they led east, toward Nevada, toward the Mojave, toward an old-world concrete giant that still held back a river, Hoover Dam. Even people who have never seen the dam know what it represents. In the wasteland, power is not only a metaphor, it is electricity. It is water pumps that work. It is lights that stay on long enough to read by. It is machines that hum instead of rusting silently. The dam was a prize so obvious it might as well have had a beacon lit over it. So the NCR moved toward it the way thirst moves toward water. But the NCR did not arrive in the Mojave as a single confident stride. It arrived as a series of cautious steps, scouting parties, rangers, small units moving along broken highways, confirming rumors, measuring distances, learning what kind of land this was. And the Mojave, in those early contacts, answered with two truths. First, the dam could be restored. It could generate electricity again. It could feed the NCR's hungry grid, send power back west, and turn the Republic's growth from a gamble into a certainty. Second, the Mojave was not empty. It never is. There were the scattered towns and trading posts, good springs of life in a dry place, outposts along the roads, settlements that had survived by being overlooked and stubborn. There were tribes, too, people whose identities had formed in the long shadow of the old world's collapse, who lived by their own traditions, their own alliances, their own histories that did not include the NCR's flag. And there was New Vegas. If the NCR was a candle of civilization, New Vegas was a neon wound that refused to heal. bright, artificial, defiant. A place that felt impossible on first sight. Old world towers lit against the desert night, guarded by machines that marched with tireless precision. New Vegas had a ruler of sorts, Mr. House. An old world mind preserved and extended by technology so far beyond what most wastelanders could imagine that it might as well have been magic. His army of robots, the Securitrons, made a statement as clear as any constitution. This city is not yours. And then, beyond the city and the dam and the long highway lines, there was another force, still distant at first, like thunder that you hear before you see the storm. Caesar's Legion. To understand the NCR's Mojave years, you have to understand that the Legion was not simply a rival army. It was an ideology sharpened into a blade. Tribes conquered and remade into a single, brutal machine, moving west under a leader who called himself Caesar, wearing the costume of ancient empire with deadly seriousness. Where the NCR promised law, the Legion promised conquest. Where the NCR argued about taxes, the Legion punished dissent with spectacle. Where the NCR tried to build a future that resembled the old world's democracy, the Legion built a future that resembled the old world's cruelty. And when two futures reach for the same river, the water does not stay calm. Before the Mojave campaign became famous, before the songs and the bitter jokes, there was a smaller, quieter moment of agreement that shaped everything that followed. In 2027, NCR Rangers and the Desert Rangers of Nevada met to sign the Ranger Unification Treaty. The Desert Rangers, long used to surviving with little support, agreed to be absorbed into the NCR's Ranger Corps in exchange for the NCR's commitment to defend key parts of the region: Hoover Dam, New Vegas, and southern Nevada, against the Legion's growing pressure. It is easy to romanticize that treaty, to imagine a solemn handshake, a shared flask, a promise made under starlight. But in practical terms, it was a recognition of arithmetic. The Mojave was becoming too dangerous for lone guardians, and the NCR needed experienced eyes that knew the land. So the Rangers changed. They took in the Desert Rangers' traditions, the dusters, the hard-earned instincts, the understanding that the desert does not forgive naivete. Still, even with Rangers in the field, the NCR's leadership wanted more than scouts and promises. They wanted the dam. In 2027-40, President Aaron Kimball sent the NCR Army into the Mojave in force, with the objective of occupying and repairing Hoover Dam, an official push, not merely an exploratory presence. Imagine the first true NCR columns arriving, not as conquering heroes, but as tired men and women in sun-bleached uniforms, carrying rifles and bedrolls and the weight of an entire republic's expectations. They would have looked around and tried to see the future written in the ruins: power lines restored, water systems stabilized, a foothold secured. And then they would have seen that the dam was not waiting politely. They found forces already there, tribals and robots, the complicated reality of the region asserting itself in metal and flesh. This, perhaps, is the most consistent pattern in NCR history: Wherever the Republic goes, it brings a plan. Wherever it arrives, it discovers that the world has been making its own plans in the meantime. New Vegas complicated everything. The NCR could not simply claim the city without provoking a conflict it was not ready to fight. Not with House's robots, not with the fragile logistics of a long supply line, not with the Legion's shadow growing darker in the east. So, in that same year, 2027, the NCR signed what became known as the Treaty of New Vegas, an agreement that effectively recognized House's control of the Strip, while granting the NCR control of Hoover Dam and the lion's share of its power output. On paper, it was compromise. In reality, it was a bargain made under pressure. The NCR gained the dam's electricity, enough to justify the entire operation to the citizens back home. House kept his glittering city and the autonomy that made him untouchable, and the Mojave became something like a corridor of uneasy coexistence, where NCR troopers guarded roads, Rangers watched the hills, and everyone pretended that a truce made the future certain. But the desert does not respect paper. It respects force, and it respects time. In 2027, that uneasy corridor erupted into the First Battle of Hoover Dam. NCR troopers and Rangers facing Caesar's Legion in a fight that was as symbolic as it was strategic. If you listen closely to NCR veterans, you'll notice how often they describe that battle not as a glorious victory, but as a moment that changed the flavor of their hope. The NCR held the dam, yes, but holding something is not the same as owning it. A held position is a posture. It must be maintained. It must be fed. It must be defended again and again, until even victory starts to feel like a bill that comes due every morning. After 2027, the NCR's Mojave presence grew heavier. Outposts multiplied, patrols lengthened, supply caravans had to travel farther and more often. Every additional trooper needed water, food, ammunition. Every additional mile of road needed protection. And back west, in the core states, the NCR's citizens still expected what citizens always expect: that the Republic would deliver. Cheap power, safe trade, a future that felt more predictable than the past. So the NCR did what growing governments do. It stretched. It stretched until the fabric of its logistics began to thin. Troopers in the Mojave started to feel the distance between the Republic's ideals and the Republic's reality. Orders came from offices far away. Supplies arrived late or not at all. Promotions sometimes went to the well-connected rather than the competent. Corruption, small at first, like sand in a boot, became a constant irritation. And meanwhile, the Legion waited. The Legion did not need to build schools or maintain courts. It did not need to convince citizens with ballots and speeches. It only needed to keep marching, keep conquering, keep applying pressure until the NCR's stretched lines began to tremble. This is how the NCR's quiet history becomes a story of strain. Not because the NCR stopped believing in itself, but because belief alone cannot keep an outpost supplied. Belief cannot keep a soldier warm at night. Belief cannot replace a missing caravan. Out here, under the Mojave stars, the NCR was learning something that every republic eventually learns. A nation is not only an idea, it is also an apparatus. and apparatuses can creak. They can jam. They can fail, especially at the edges, where the desert tests every assumption. So when you hear NCR voices in the Mojave, tired, sarcastic, stubborn, understand what you're hearing. You're hearing the sound of a republic trying to extend itself across a harsh land, bargaining with old-world ghosts, facing a rival empire, and discovering that the cost of civilization is always higher than the slogans promised. The fire beside you is low again, the heat gentler, the light softer. And in that soft light, you might begin to sense what comes next. Because the Mojave is not merely a battlefield. It is a mirror. In it, the NCR sees itself, its courage, its compromises, its hunger, its bureaucracy, its best intentions, and its worst habits, reflected in dust and neon and river water. In the next chapter, we'll follow that reflection into the day-to-day life of NCR rule in the Mojave. The outposts, the Rangers, the politics, the uneasy partnerships, and the quiet ways a republic can start to resemble the very old world it claims to rebuild. Chapter 4: The Mojave Ledger. Outposts, farms, and fraying lines. In the Mojave, the NCR is not an idea first. It is a sound. The clink of canteens on a trooper's belt. The dull scrape of a pen across a requisition form. The rattle of a supply truck crossing broken pavement. The distant crack of rifle fire, routine almost, where patrols brush against raiders and chem gangs in the sun-bleached hours before dusk. Out here, the Republic is made of small, daily work. It is built not only at Hoover Dam, but at the places between the dam and the people who benefit from it. If you want to understand the NCR's quiet history in the Mojave, imagine a ledger, page after page of numbers and names. This region is the part of the ledger where ink begins to smear, where margins run thin, where every entry costs more than it should, because the Mojave is a long way from home. The NCR's core territories, its heartland, as politicians like to say, sit west, where the Republic's institutions are older, and the roads are safer, and the citizens know what a courthouse is supposed to look like. In the Mojave, the NCR is still a guest that arrived with too many suitcases and too much confidence. And a guest, no matter how well armed, still needs to eat. So the NCR built a spine through the desert. Bases, camps, outposts, and routes meant to keep troops fed and equipment moving. Camp McCarran, set in the old shell of McCarran International Airport, became the main NCR base in southern Nevada. A crowded hub where soldiers trained, supplies piled, and orders went out like sparks. McCarran is the kind of place that makes you feel the Republic's weight. There are too many uniforms, too many faces with the same tired look. Too many people waiting for someone higher up to decide what happens next. Even the building itself, its corridors and gates, feels like a memory of a world that believed in scale. From there, the NCR tried to hold everything at once. The roads to the dam, the lanes toward New Vegas, the trade arteries that justified the entire campaign. And the campaign's justification was never subtle. Hoover Dam could generate power. Under the New Vegas Treaty, the NCR was legally permitted to divert the overwhelming majority of that electricity back to its home states, while a small portion went to the Strip.
That treaty matters because it reveals how the Mojave looks from the NCR's perspective, not only as a battlefield, but as infrastructure, power, water, stability that can be measured and shipped. In-game dialogue and lore summaries even emphasize how quickly the NCR moved to restore output after occupation. Another reminder that, for the Republic, the dam is not a monument. It is a machine that must keep running. But machines require maintenance, and so do armies. So the NCR planted more than forts. It planted farms. The NCR sharecropper farms, civilian agriculture supported and protected by NCR forces, became one of the most practical expressions of the Republic's approach. They were meant to feed the Mojave campaign, crops moving toward McCarran, the dam, and other NCR positions, turning sunlight and water into calories and morale. On paper, it is sensible, almost elegant. In practice, it becomes another stress point, because the Mojave does not give water freely, and when a farm depends on water and protection, it becomes political. A republic's hunger is never just hunger. It's policy, logistics, and the quiet resentment of people who feel they're paying the price for someone else's grand plan. Now, layer the republic's security problem on top of that. The NCR in the Mojave is constantly fighting fires, sometimes literal ones. Powder gangers, escaped convicts originally brought in to rebuild railroads, rose out of a prison riot and turned the NCR correctional facility into a fortified stronghold, using the explosive they'd been issued for labor as weapons. This is an important detail because it shows how thin the NCR's control can be. The Republic brings order, but it also brings systems. Systems can be exploited. A penal labor project becomes a raider problem. A solution becomes a new line item in the Mojave ledger. Caravans attacked, patrols diverted, resources drained. And the powder gangers are only one kind of bleed. Near New Vegas, the NCR constantly clashes with the fiends, violent raiders and chem addicts who haunt the region around the Strip, turning the outskirts into a perpetual firefight. To a newcomer, this can be confusing. How can the NCR be in control if raiders are so close to the city's shining lights? The answer is that the NCR is not in control in the way an empire claims to be. It is present. It is trying. It is stretched. The Republic has to protect caravans and farms, hold the dam, maintain relations with Mr. House's Vegas, watch Caesar's Legion across the Colorado, and still pretend, back in the core states, that the Mojave is an investment that will pay off cleanly. So the NCR starts making the kinds of choices large governments make when they're overextended. They prioritize what can be measured. They secure the dam and the major bases. They tolerate messy edges. They accept that some places will remain dangerous because they do not have enough boots, enough rations, enough time. And that is where the Rangers come back into the story, not as legend, but as necessity.
By treaty, the Desert Rangers had been absorbed into the NCR's Rangers structure in exchange for NCR protection of key Mojave assets and southern Nevada against the Legion. Rangers in the Mojave become the Republic's long eyes, scouting, hunting threats, and doing the grim arithmetic of frontier security. They are also a reminder of what the NCR wants to be seen as: capable, righteous, competent. But even Rangers cannot fix the deeper problem. The deeper problem is distance, physical, political, and moral. Physical distance means supply lines. Every crate has to travel. Every soldier has to be paid. Every repair requires parts that are never where you need them. Political distance means that decisions are made far away by people who do not smell the Mojave dust. Those decisions arrive as orders and quotas. They arrive as ambitious goals that sound clean in a speech, but become ugly when translated into daily life. And moral distance. This is the quietest and most dangerous. Means that the NCR begins, sometimes without realizing it, to treat the Mojave as a means rather than a place. That is when a republic starts to feel like a machine. Not evil necessarily, not deliberately cruel, simply indifferent in the way large systems become indifferent. Because they cannot afford to care about every individual cost when they are chasing an outcome measured in megawatts and territory. And yet, despite all that, there is something that remains undeniably human in the NCR's presence here. A trooper at a gate who is exhausted but still gives a traveler directions. A farmhand who complains about shortages but plants anyway. A ranger who never speaks of glory, only of keeping the road quiet for one more night. The NCR's quiet history in the Mojave is not the story of a clean triumph. It is the story of people trying to carry a complicated civilization through a landscape that punishes complexity. And always, beyond the daily firefights and the paperwork and the weary patrols, the Republic can feel the river like a pulse, the Colorado. Across it waits the Legion and the memory of the first battle of Hoover Dam, and the certainty that the second battle, whether the NCR wants it or not, will eventually come due. So the NCR keeps writing in its ledger. One more outpost staffed, one more caravan escorted, one more raid repelled, one more requisition approved, one more promise made. And if you listen to the desert long enough, you can hear the underlying fear beneath the Republic's routine. That the Mojave might not be won by ideals, that it might be won by endurance. That the side that survives the longest, despite hunger, bureaucracy, corruption, and exhaustion, will be the side that writes the next chapter of history. The fire burns lower again, as if it too is keeping accounts. And in the softening dark, the Mojave feels less like a place and more like a question whispered to anyone who claims to be building a nation. How much can you carry before you become what you fear? Chapter 5. The Republic's Faces. Crocker's smile, Hanlon's silence. If you walk the Mojave long enough, you learn a strange rule. A nation is never one thing. It is not only its flag, or its laws, or its victories. Out here, a nation is the people who speak in its name, each of them carrying a different version of what the Republic is supposed to be. At Camp McCarran, the NCR feels like a body that cannot stop moving. Troopers march, couriers arrive, orders change hands. Someone is always waiting on a shipment that is late, or a report that is incomplete, or a decision that will be made somewhere far away by someone who will never taste Mojave dust. McCarran is the NCR's operational heart in southern Nevada, and hearts are not quiet places. But even there, When night comes and the noise softens, you can hear the quieter thing beneath the activity. Worry. Not the sharp panic of a settlement under raid, but the long, grinding worry of overextension. The kind that lives in ledgers and ration counts. The kind that makes a soldier stare at a map and feel the distance between home and here like a weight. In the Mojave, the NCR wears many faces. There is the official face, the diplomatic one, polite, reasonable, full of practiced calm. The face that insists everything is under control because admitting otherwise would be politically fatal. That face belongs in places like the NCR Embassy on the Strip, where words are chosen carefully, where every sentence is part of a larger bargain. The Mojave, after all, is not merely occupied, it is negotiated. The Treaty of New Vegas is the clearest proof of that. Under its terms, Mr. House keeps sovereignty over the Strip, while the NCR gains rights to establish bases at Hoover Dam and McCarran, and is legally permitted to send the vast majority of Hoover Dam's electricity back west, commonly summarized as 95% to NCR home states, with 5% to the Strip. On paper, it sounds like a triumph. In practice, it creates a quiet humiliation that never fully fades. The NCR bleeds for the Mojave, but does not truly own its brightest city. NCR citizens can visit the Strip, spend their money, enjoy the lights, and still remain subject to House's rules once they step into his territory. And so the NCR's diplomatic face smiles and says partnership, while its soldiers grit their teeth and say nothing at all. Then there is the military face. This face believes in objectives. It believes that a strong presence creates stability, and stability creates compliance, and compliance turns into control. It speaks in the language of outposts, patrol routes, and secure supply lines. It looks at the Mojave and sees a puzzle that can be solved by placing enough men in the right places. This face is always staring east, because beyond the river is the Legion, patient and merciless. The NCR's victory at the First Battle of Hoover Dam in 2027 did not end the threat. It only proved that the dam could be held at a cost the Mojave never forgets. And after that battle, the NCR's position becomes a posture that must be maintained every day. Guard shifts, repairs, intelligence, counter-infiltration, and the weary discipline of watching the horizon for a war that everyone knows is returning. Then there is the Ranger's face. It is not a public face. It does not often appear in speeches. It is the look of someone who has watched too many hopeful plans collapse under heat and distance. The Rangers are there, in part, because of the Ranger Unification Treaty, signed in 2027 at Mojave Outpost, where the Desert Rangers of Nevada agreed to be absorbed into the NCR in exchange for NCR protection of Hoover Dam, New Vegas, and southern Nevada against Caesar's Legion. That history matters because it explains the Rangers' temperament. The Desert Rangers did not join out of romance. They joined because the Mojave was becoming a corridor for something worse, and the old lone guardian model was no longer enough. So Rangers patrol where the Republic's regular forces cannot be everywhere at once. They scout, they track, they clean up problems that never make it into official reports. They are the Republic's long shadow, and shadows see what bright banners often refuse to see. They see the fraying edges. They see towns that accept NCR protection but resent NCR taxes. They see local groups treated as obstacles rather than communities. They see the slow creep of cynicism in troopers who came to build a better world, and instead found themselves guarding supply depots while politicians back west talk about progress. And they see, perhaps most clearly, the way the NCR's systems can be used against it. Take the powder gangers. Once they were a solution, convicts brought by the NCR to do hard labor, like rebuilding rail lines. They were given dynamite for work. They were controlled through harsh discipline. And, predictably, some of them learned how to hide small amounts of explosives, how to wait, how to turn the Republic's tools into weapons. Eventually, a riot and breakout turned the NCR correctional facility into a powder ganger stronghold, and the problem that had been contained became a bleeding wound along the roads. This is the Mojave lesson, written in soot and broken concrete. When a nation tries to manage people like resources, those people learn to behave like enemies. And the Mojave has enemies enough already. Near the Strip, another pressure never fully eases: the fiends, chem-fueled raiders who terrorize the region and are frequently in open conflict with NCR patrols. Even lore summaries describe this as a long-running series of armed conflicts, rather than a clean, winnable campaign, which tells you what it feels like on the ground. Endless, exhausting, grinding. So the NCR holds bases and farms and roads, but cannot make the world fully safe. Not here. Not with its lines stretched and its attention split between House, the Legion, and the everyday violence that grows wherever law arrives slowly. And then there are the farms, the NCR's quietest face. Not uniforms, not speeches, just fields. The NCR sharecropper farms exist to produce crops that supply places like McCarran and Hoover Dam. They are NCR-owned farmland, worked by civilian farmers who trade labor for relative safety, clean food, and water. Though even inside that arrangement, gratitude is not guaranteed. In another world, those farms would be a symbol of peace, a place where sunlight becomes bread, where the future looks like harvest rather than firefight. In the Mojave, they become a symbol of dependence. Because farms need water, farms need protection, farms need stability. And stability out here is not a natural condition. It is an expensive service. So civilians labor under NCR oversight, soldiers guard them, and resentment grows in small, invisible places, where people feel the Republic's presence most keenly, not in safety, but in rules. This is where the NCR's quiet history becomes complicated in a way that feels almost painfully human. The NCR does not arrive as a cartoon villain. It arrives as a familiar bureaucracy trying to solve an unfamiliar wilderness with familiar methods. It brings permits, taxes, courts, supply chains, elections back home, and the comforting lie that systems can tame everything if they are simply big enough. But the Mojave does not bend easily, so the NCR adapts, sometimes wisely, sometimes desperately. It strikes bargains with local powers because it must. It compromises with Mr. House because it cannot afford another war. It tolerates ugliness at the edges because it cannot police every mile. And it leans harder on its soldiers because the Republic's promises have already been made to its citizens back west. Promises of power, prosperity, and stability purchased with Mojave blood. When you listen to the NCR at night, this is what you hear. A republic trying to remain a republic while behaving more and more like an empire. Not because it loves domination, but because it is hungry for electricity, for water, for strategic depth, for the security that makes voters feel safe. And hunger does not make people kinder. It makes them practical. It makes them impatient. It makes them willing to trade principles for outcomes, one small trade at a time, until the principles begin to look like decorations rather than foundations. The Mojave is where those trades become visible, where a trooper complains that the Republic is asking too much, where a farmer mutters that the NCR's protection feels like a leash, where a ranger looks at the map and knows with a quiet certainty that the next battle at Hoover Dam will not be decided by slogans. It will be decided by exhaustion, by supply, by morale, by whether the NCR can still convince its own people, here and back home, that this campaign is worth what it costs. The fire has gone low again. The wind runs its fingers through dry grass, and somewhere in the dark, a distant patrol passes, boots on cracked asphalt, moving steadily, not toward glory, but toward another shift, another checkpoint, another night of holding the line. In the next chapter, we will move closer to the heart of the NCR's Mojave dilemma, how the Republic's internal politics, its competing commanders and agendas, and its uneasy relationship with Vegas itself all tighten into a single question. When the second battle comes, will the NCR be fighting for the Mojave, or merely fighting to justify the price it has already paid? Chapter 6. The Quiet Verdict. What the NCR became. By the time the NCR has been in the Mojave for a few years, the desert stops asking whether the Republic is brave. The desert has seen bravery. It has seen men and women stand their ground with empty canteens, cracked lips, and rifles that jam at the worst possible moment. It has seen rangers walk alone into places that do not forgive lone walkers. It has seen engineers work under fire to keep a concrete giant breathing electricity. No, by then, the Mojave asks a different question. It asks whether the NCR can remain itself at the edge of its reach. Because the Mojave is an edge in every sense, the edge of the Republic's supply lines, the edge of its patience, the edge of its ideals, where law has to compete with hunger, fear, and the distance between a promise and the person expected to fulfill it. Out here, the NCR is always two things at once. It is the soldier on a midnight shift at Camp McCarran, largest NCR base in the region, a logistical hub built into an old airport, watching the perimeter and pretending the darkness is just darkness. And it is the clerk back west, stamping papers that decide where rations go, what contracts get funded, what patrol routes get reinforced. One is dust and fatigue, the other is ink. Together, they make a country. And the Mojave makes that country honest, sometimes brutally so. The New Vegas Treaty is a perfect example of how NCR wins and still feels compromised. Under that agreement, House's sovereignty over the Strip is recognized, while the NCR gains rights to establish bases at Hoover Dam and McCarran, and is legally permitted to send the overwhelming majority of the dam's power back to its home states, often summarized as 95% to the NCR, 5% to the Strip. That single ratio, so neat, so clean, does not describe the human cost. It does not describe the trooper who has not seen Shady Sands or the boneyard in years. It does not describe the ranger who has buried friends in shallow desert graves because the ground is too hard for anything deeper. It does not describe the quiet resentment of locals who feel like their home has become an extraction site. Power sent west, profits tallied elsewhere, while danger stays here. In the Republic's heartland, those numbers look like progress. In the Mojave, those numbers sound like distance. And distance makes people tired in a way sleep cannot easily fix. The NCR has always believed in the power of agreements. It was born from them. It stitched itself together settlement by settlement, turning fragile cooperation into something that looked, from far away, like inevitability. The Ranger Unification Treaty was part of that stitching. In 2027, the Desert Rangers agreed to be absorbed into the NCR in exchange for NCR protection of Hoover Dam, New Vegas, and southern Nevada against Caesar's Legion. It is a noble bargain when you say it quickly. It is a desperate bargain when you say it slowly, because it admits the truth that the Mojave is too big and too cruel for any one group to safeguard alone. That the old ways of lone justice, one ranger, one rifle, one trail, were being ground down by a larger, uglier force. So the NCR absorbed the Rangers, and the Rangers gave the NCR something priceless: competence, experience, eyes that could see the thin places in the Republic's armor, and those thin places multiplied. The powder gangers are one of the Mojave's most bitter lessons, a managed problem that became a wound. A prison break and takeover at the NCR Correctional Facility turned convicts into a hostile faction, terrorizing roads the Republic could not spare enough troops to properly secure. The fiends are another lesson. Violence that cannot be cleanly solved because solving it would require attention the NCR cannot fully afford while staring across the river at the Legion. Even McCarran's records and lore emphasize constant pressure from threats nearby. So the NCR compromises, not always because it wants to, but because it must. It leaves problems simmering. It assigns too few troops to too many miles. It relies on rangers to patch gaps that should not exist in a well-funded campaign. And then it tells itself, back in the core states, that this is temporary, that once the Mojave is fully secured, everything will stabilize. But temporary has a way of becoming policy, and policy in the wasteland has a way of becoming identity. This is where the NCR's quiet history becomes most important for a listener who is new to the universe. Because the NCR is not simply the good guys, and it is not simply the corrupt empire. It is the most human kind of thing, an experiment that grew larger than its founders could have fully predicted. It began as Shady Sands refusing to die. It became a republic because people wanted a life where the next day did not depend on the mood of the nearest gunman. And then it expanded, partly to protect itself, partly to feed itself, partly because it believed its way was better than the alternatives. That belief is not a lie. It is also not a guarantee. Democracy can be sincere and still become heavy-handed. Institutions can bring safety and still breed corruption. Laws can protect people and still be used to squeeze them. A republic can carry a flag into the desert and still, slowly, begin to resemble an empire, simply because empires and republics both require the same thing when they expand: control. And control is expensive. It demands taxes. It demands compliance. It demands soldiers who hold a line so that someone else, far away, can feel secure. The Mojave is the place where the NCR pays that bill in full view of everyone. That is why the second battle feels inevitable in the air long before it happens in anyone's timeline. Not because fate loves drama, because pressure loves release. Two visions of order, the NCR's bureaucratic, elective, compromise-heavy model, and Caesar's brutal, absolutist model, are leaning on the same river. The dam stands between them like a jaw clenched against a scream. And both sides know in their quiet moments that the dam cannot remain a compromise forever. So what is the NCR's quiet history, really? It is not a straight road from rubble to glory. It is a long, uneven walk towards something that might be called civilization, if it survives long enough to deserve the name. It is the sound of patrol boots on broken asphalt. It is the smell of ink in a dusty office. It is the feeling of a citizen back west flipping on a light, never thinking about the soldier who made that light possible. It is the ranger at Mojave Outpost reading an old monument and understanding what it truly says: that the Republic came here to protect, that it stayed here to profit, that it remains here because leaving would admit failure. And failure for a republic is not only political, it is spiritual. Because if the NCR cannot make the Mojave better, not perfect, not pure, but better, then what was the point of all those laws, all those speeches, all those ballots, all those graves? The fire beside you is nearly out now. The coals glow softly, like a city seen from far away, quiet, fragile, worth guarding. The wind drifts over the sand and smooths the day's footprints until the ground looks untouched, as if no one ever marched here at all. But the history remains, not loud, not triumphant, just present, like the desert itself. And if you fall asleep with that thought, let it be a gentle one. In a world that ended once, the NCR is proof that people tried to build again. They tried, imperfectly, stubbornly, and at great cost. They tried to make the future less cruel than the past. And in the wasteland, that attempt, quiet as it is, matters.